Before we get started, drop your city in the comments. Doesn't matter if you're watching from Halifax, Thunder Bay, or somewhere in the middle of nowhere with a good Wi-Fi signal. Let us know where you're from. And if this is your first time here, welcome to Ivory Secrets. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next now. Let's talk about a woman named Serena Voss Whitfield. Not to be confused with the Serena you might know from The Office, or the one your neighbor talks about at the fence. This Serena had a last name that opened doors, literally, including the hand-carved mahogany ones at the Whitfield Group headquarters in downtown Toronto. She had been married to its founder's son for 11 years. She had raised 2 children in a house with 9 bedrooms that she'd never asked for. She had sat at dinners with city councilors and venture capitalists and pretended, very professionally, that she found the conversation interesting. And for most of those 11 years, people had looked at her and seen exactly what she allowed them to see. A wife, quietly supportive, elegantly dressed, unremarkable. That was the plan. It always had been. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in early February, 3 weeks before the Whitfield Group's annual gala. It was slipped through the mail slot of their home in Rosedale. Not emailed, not texted, deliberately physical. And it landed on the tile floor of the front hallway with a soft sound that nobody in the house noticed except Serena. She was the only one awake. She picked it up, recognized the cream stock and the embossed crest immediately, and set it on the kitchen counter beside her coffee. She didn't open it for 40 minutes. She finished her coffee. She read 3 pages of a novel she'd been meaning to finish for a month. She watched the first gray light come through the kitchen window and turn the snow on the back garden a faint shade of blue. Then she opened it. The invitation was for the annual gala, of course. But this year it was different. This year it was being held at the Whitfield estate in Muskoka, not the Four Seasons. This year the note at the bottom read, "All principal family members are expected to attend. Formal dress, no exceptions." Serena read the note twice. Then she set the invitation face down on the counter and sent upstairs to get dressed. She already knew what was coming. She had known for 14 months. The question was never whether, it was when. Her husband's name was Rowan Whitfield, 44 years old, 3rd-generation money. The kind of man who believed that inherited confidence was the same thing as earned authority. He was not unkind, exactly, but he was careless in the way that people are when they have never had to be careful. He forgot birthdays but remembered wine vintages. He was charming at parties and distant at breakfast. He had been unfaithful for the last 2 years, with a woman named Cassidy whom he had introduced to the family as a consulting partner, and who had, by the time the gala invitation arrived, been to the Muskoka estate 3 times. Serena knew this because she had always paid attention. Not in a paranoid way. Not in the way of someone scanning texts over a shoulder or following cars down Yonge Street. She paid attention because attention was her nature. It had been since she was a girl in Saskatoon, watching. Her mother ran a household on a budget that required precision. Watching nothing go to waste, watching everything mean something. She had brought that attention into her marriage, and into her work, and into every room she had ever sat in quietly. While someone underestimated her, she had known about Cassidy because Cassidy had made a small error, not a dramatic one. No lipstick on a collar, nothing so obvious. Cassidy had once, 18 months ago, left a voicemail on the wrong phone. Not Rowan's personal cell, the household landline, which nobody used anymore except Serena, who kept it active because her mother still called on it from Saskatchewan. The voicemail was 8 seconds long. A woman's voice, warm, familiar, slightly impatient. "It's me. Tell him the Whistler trip is confirmed. The chalet's booked for the 14th. Serena had listened to it once, saved it, deleted it from the visible log. Then she'd sat down at her desk and done what she always did when something important happened. She got organized. What people did not know about Serena, what Rowan himself had long since stopped being curious about, was that before she married him, before Rosedale and the galas and the 9-bedroom house, she had spent 7 years as a forensic financial consultant, not a title that came up at dinner parties, not something she'd put on her bio at school fundraisers, but it was the thing she was, underneath everything else. She understood how money moved. She understood how structures worked, trusts, holding companies, shell entities, beneficial ownership. She understood the language of corporate documents the way a musician understands sheet music. Instantly, without effort, in a way that felt like reading her own thoughts. When she married Rowan, she'd stepped back from client work. That had been his preference, expressed not as a demand but as an atmosphere, a repeated emphasis on how much the family needed her present, how much the children needed stability, how much easier everything would be if she weren't splitting her attention. And she had agreed. Not because she was weak, because she was patient. What she had not stopped doing was paying attention to the Whitfield Group's finances. She had access because she was a shareholder. A minority one, yes, but a shareholder nonetheless, with rights she had negotiated quietly before an initial agreement that Rowan's father had reviewed and found unremarkable. Serena had been counting on it being found unremarkable. She had written it to look that way. The shares came with access to quarterly reports. The quarterly reports, read by someone who knew what to look for, told a story. The story began about 3 years ago. A series of consultant invoices, each just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic audit flag. A recurring retainer to an incorporated entity called Fairhaven Advisory Group. A name that sounded institutional, but when she traced it through corporate registry filings, resolved to a numbered company with a single director, Cassidy. Over 18 months, the retainer had totaled just over $800,000. Serena had printed the documents. She had filed them in a folder she kept in the back of a locked drawer in her home office, behind a collection of her children's old report cards, because she knew nobody would ever look there. She had also quietly consulted a lawyer, not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A corporate lawyer, a woman named Beverly Okafor, who was the kind of lawyer you went to when you needed someone who could hold a complicated situation without flinching. Beverly had reviewed the documents, asked precise and unsentimental questions, and then looked across her desk at Serena and said, "This is misuse of corporate funds. This is embezzlement. You know that." Serena had said, "I know." Beverly had asked, "What do you want to do?" And Serena had said, "I want to wait." Beverly had looked at her for a long moment. Then she'd nodded once and said she'd be ready when Serena was. The gala was on a Saturday in late February. The drive up to Muskoka took a little under 3 hours in winter traffic. Serena sat in the passenger seat of their car and watched the highway give way to county roads, and then to the kind of landscape that looked like it had been designed to remind you that human concerns were very small: black, spruce, and white birch, and the gray expanse of frozen lake visible between the trees. Rowan drove. He was quiet in a way that felt rehearsed, and Serena recognized it as the quiet of someone who had decided something and hadn't told her yet. She found that interesting. They arrived at the estate to find it lit up in a way it usually wasn't. Strings of warm white lights along the front drive, cars already filling the gravel parking area, staff in dark jackets moving with the polished efficiency of people who'd been briefed very specifically. The Whitfield family gala was, in normal years, a 120-person dinner that functioned, mostly, as a networking event for people who didn't need to network. This year, it felt different, tighter, more deliberate. Serena stepped out of the car into the cold February air and adjusted her coat. Inside, the main hall of the estate had been opened up to its full capacity. A room that usually felt generously sized now held perhaps 80 people, and still managed to feel like it had been composed like a photograph someone had planned very carefully. A string quartet played in the corner. Waitstaff circulated with glasses of champagne and sparkling water. Serena took a glass of sparkling water. This was something people noticed, or should have noticed. She never drank at these events. Not because she disapproved of drinking, but because she liked being the sharpest person in the room when she needed to be. And she had learned early that these events always, at some point, required it. Rowan disappeared toward the bar. Within 10 minutes of their arrival, she let him. She moved through the room slowly, speaking to the people she liked, being pleasant to the ones she didn't, and noticing everything. She noticed that Cassidy had arrived separately and was standing near the windows in a dress that was clearly chosen to be noticed. A deep, garnet color, very fitted, The kind of dress that communicated I belong here to the people. Who would be convinced by that, and communicated something rather different to the people who weren't. She noticed that Rowan had found his to stand near Cassidy within 12 minutes. She noticed that Rowan's father, Gerald, 72 years old, still physically imposing, a man who had built the Whitfield Group from a regional construction company into a diversified holding company over 4 decades, was standing at the far end of the room, near the fireplace. He was talking to a man Serena recognized as the family's corporate counsel. They were speaking quietly. Gerald had not looked at Rowan once since they'd arrived. She filed all of this away and kept circulating. The formal dinner began at 7:30. Serena was seated as always to Rowan's left at the family table. Cassidy, she noted, had been seated 2 tables away, close enough to be visible, far enough to be deniable. It was the kind of arrangement that required someone to think about it in advance, which meant someone had thought about it in advance. Rowan gave a short speech before the first course, welcoming the guests, thanking the staff, making 2 jokes that landed. He was very good at speeches. It was one of the things Serena had once admired about him. This capacity to stand in a room and make everyone feel included, held, attended to. It was a gift. She still thought so, he said, at one point during the speech, gesturing toward the table. The Whitfield name has always meant something, because the people who carry it have always been willing to build rather than borrow, to create rather than inherit, to move forward rather than look back. He looked at Serena when he said, "Move forward rather than look back." She held his gaze and smiled, because she was very, very good at smiling. What she was thinking behind the smile was that she had heard this formulation before, or one like it. She had heard it 2 weeks ago, when Rowan had sat her down at the kitchen table, and, in the carefully measured tone of a man who has rehearsed, said that he thought the marriage had run its course, that they had grown in different directions, that he wanted to have an honest conversation about the future, about the house, about how they could handle things thoughtfully before the situation became complicated. He had not mentioned Cassidy. She had not mentioned the documents in the locked drawer. She had listened carefully to everything he said, and then, in the silence that followed, picked up her coffee cup and finished the last half-inch, and set it down and said, "I'll think about what you've said, that was all." He had looked slightly thrown. She suspected he had expected something else, tears perhaps, or anger, or the kind of collapse that would have given him the upper hand. Instead, she had given him nothing to work with, and she had watched him try to recalibrate in real time, and that had told her everything she needed to know about where his confidence was coming from. He thought she didn't know. He thought she was going to be manageable. The speeches ended. The first course arrived. The room moved into the comfortable low-grade noise of a large dinner party. Silverware, conversation, the quiet industry of people performing normalcy. Serena sat and ate her salad and listened to the man to her right, a port developer from Ottawa, named Stuart, whom she had met twice before, talk about a project on the Ottawa. As she asked the right questions, she made the sounds, and across the room she watched, without appearing to watch, as Gerald Whitfield excused himself from his table, and walked to where the family's corporate counsel was now seated, and bent down to say something brief into the man's ear. The counsel nodded once, and left the room. Gerald straightened up and looked across the dinner, to where his son was sitting. Rowan didn't notice. He was leaning slightly toward the table where Cassidy was sitting, 2 rows away, his body angled with an inclination he had no idea was visible. Gerald noticed. Serena noticed Gerald noticing. She took a sip of her water. The toast happened at the end of the main course. Gerald stood, and the room quieted, in the way rooms quiet for men who have spent a long time earning that particular silence. He talked about legacy. He talked about what it meant to build something that lasted. He talked about accountability, not in abstract terms but in specific ones, in the language of a man who had spent 4 decades reading balance sheets and knew exactly how much damage a single line item could do to a structure built over generations. He did not look at Rowan while he said any of this. Then he said, "There are decisions that have to be made when you love something more than you love your own comfort." My father taught me that. I have tried to teach it to my children. He paused. Some lessons take longer than others. A few people laughed lightly, because they assumed it was a general observation. Serena did not laugh. She set down her glass and folded her hands in her lap and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, nothing so uncomplicated as that. Something quieter, the feeling of a very long wait reaching its end. After the toast, Gerald sat back down, and within 15 minutes, the corporate counsel returned to the room and made his way to Rowan's chair and bent down, and said something that made Rowan go completely still. Rowan turned to look at his father. His father was speaking to someone else and didn't turn back. What happened over the next 72 hours was not a single event, but a sequence of them. The way a structure doesn't collapse all at once, but rather fails at the load points, one by one, until the rest is just physics. The corporate counsel had returned to the room because Gerald had, that afternoon, executed a series of legal instructions he had been preparing for 6 weeks. A formal review of the Whitfield Group's executive accounts had been filed with the company's external auditors. Not the standard annual review, but a targeted forensic one, focused on a specific category of consultant, invoicing over a 30-month period. The instruction had been drafted in language so precise that anyone who read it would understand that the person who requested it already knew what the auditors would find. Rowan had been removed as a signing authority on the corporate accounts effective that evening. This was legal. The shareholder agreement gave Gerald, as founding director, the authority to trigger a governance review that suspended executive powers pending an audit outcome. It was a clause that had never been used in 40 years of family business. It had been included in the shareholder agreement at Serena's suggestion. 11 years ago, when the prenuptial was being negotiated and Gerald had asked her, almost as an afterthought, what else she thought the family governance structure might need. She had been 29 years old. She had mentioned it the way you mention something obvious, something almost administrative, something that any competent corporate advisor would flag. Gerald had nodded and made a note, and she had moved on, and neither of them had ever referred to it again. She had spent 11 years hoping she'd never need it. She had also spent 11 years making sure it would work perfectly if she did. The weekend did not end cleanly. Things rarely do. Rowan found her on the Saturday night, after the dinner had dissolved and most guests had gone to bed or to their cars. She was standing near the back windows of the great room, looking out at the lake. The ice was solid, and the moon was bright, and the whole landscape had that quality of winter nights in Ontario. Absolute. Indifferent. Older than anything you could say about it. He was not angry, which surprised her slightly. He was something closer to bewildered. You knew, he said. She didn't turn around immediately. She looked at the lake for another moment. Then she said, yes, he said. How long? She said. Long enough. He was quiet. Then he said, in a voice that sounded like he was working something out, the clause in the shareholder agreement. Yes, you put that there. I suggested it. Your father agreed. It's in the document. Another silence. The kind that happens when someone is reconfiguring a story they thought they knew. He said, why didn't you just? And then stopped because she turned around, and whatever he saw on her face made him stop. She was not angry either. She had made a decision. A long time ago. That anger was too expensive. It cost too much attention, too much energy, too much of the precision she needed. She had stored the grief somewhere safe and had not let it into this room. She said, Rowan, I want you to think very carefully about what you were planning, not what you were feeling. I understand what you were feeling. I mean what you were planning to do with the company's money. With our money. With the money that our children will one day benefit from. I want you to think about whether that was something you were going to tell me. He didn't answer. She nodded. She said, Beverly Okafor will be in touch Monday morning. I'd suggest you have someone good in place by then. She picked up her glass of water, still sparkling, still cold, and walked past him toward the hallway, and she did not look back. The weeks that followed were not the kind that make for simple stories. There were lawyers. There were difficult conversations conducted, across conference tables in the kind of rooms that exist specifically for difficult conversations, neutral spaces, deliberately, impersonal, full of water pitchers and whiteboards, and the particular silence of people choosing their words very carefully. There were 2 conversations with their children, aged 9 and 12, that were the hardest things Serena had done in years. Harder than any of the rest of it. Harder than the documents and the waiting and the gala and the confrontation, because her children were real in a way that legal proceedings were not, and the grief she had kept so carefully contained did not stay contained. When she was sitting across from her daughter and trying to explain that some things change. The audit concluded that $807,000 in corporate funds had been disbursed to Fairhaven Advisory Group for services that could not be substantiated. The matter was referred to the relevant authorities. Cassidy's lawyer contacted Beverly Okafor 3 times in the first week. Beverly responded to each contact with exactly the same brief and immovable message. Rowan kept the house in Rosedale initially, by mutual agreement and for the sake of continuity for the children. Serena moved into a condominium in the Distillery District that she had quietly purchased 14 months ago. In her own name, through a trust structure that bore no reference to the Whitfield name. She had chosen it because it had large windows and good light and was walking distance from a market she liked. She found to her surprise that she slept better there than she had in years. There is something people say about situations like this, a thing they reach for, when they're trying to make sense of it. When they want a clean moral, they say the person who waited was the smart one, the strategic one, the one who won. Serena would tell you, if she were the kind of person who told you things, that it wasn't strategy at its core. It was something quieter than that. It was the understanding, developed slowly over many years in many rooms, where no one was looking at her, that the most powerful position you can occupy is the one people have decided isn't important. She had learned this from her mother, who had managed a household in Saskatoon on a teacher's key salary, and somehow made it feel abundant. She had learned it from 7 years of work in which she moved through corporate structures, that no one protected because no one thought they needed protecting. She had learned it in 11 years of marriage to a man who had stopped being curious about her somewhere around year 4, which meant that she had spent 7 years being invisible to the person who shared her home. And invisibility, she had found, was a remarkable thing to have on your side. She was 41 years old. She had 2 children who were confused and sad, and also, slowly, beginning to find their footing again. Her daughter had recently started a new after-school art class and came home on Thursdays with paint on her sleeves and something lighter in her face. Her son had asked her last week if they could get a dog. She had said she'd think about it. She was sitting at the window of the Distillery District apartment on a Thursday afternoon in April, spring finally arriving in Toronto, the way it always did. Without warning, all at once, the air suddenly different, and she was working. Not managing a household, not attending a dinner, working with the particular focus of someone who had been waiting a long time to do something and was now, finally, doing it. Beverly Okafor had referred her to 3 clients in the last month. There were more coming. Serena opened a new document, typed a header, and thought about what it meant to begin, again, at 41, with a clearer sense of yourself than you'd had at 29. She thought it was probably not the beginning people would have predicted for her. It was definitely not the one Rowan would have predicted. But then she had never been particularly interested in what people predicted for her. She took a sip of her coffee, medium roast, no sugar, from the market 2 blocks away, and got back to work.